Hi, welcome to Outlaw Bookseller with me, Stephen E. Andrews, and today is going to be a bit sedate because I'm in a sedate mode. We're going to take our time, but for those of you who are impatient, let's get it out of the way first of all. You've seen the title, The Greatest Hard SF Writer You've Never Read, or maybe ever read if you're older, and we're going to talk about Bob Shaw. As we see, we have a handsome Bob Shaw title here on the podium, The Ragged Astronauts. And we're going to have a look at his career, and I'm going to talk to you about my personal sort of subjective experience of reading his work, which is critically acclaimed. And I'm going to go slowly today because I've just been for a walk for an hour, and I took an apple down the field to feed the local donkey, and I do like donkeys. It's the stoicism and the humility, and they're cute as well. And I guess that comes from Philip K. Dick. You know, the sequences about mercerism in Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, one of my keynote books, where, you know, Wilbur Mercer was said to revere humble animals like the donkey and the toad and the owl. So yeah, so I really like that. So, and I'm thinking about going to Italy, which I'm going to be doing before too long. So I'm having a what looks like a cappuccino or a latte, made it myself. And it's not much like a cappuccino, there's no chocolate on it. And I've got some of these little Italian biscuits. So you'll have to bear with me, I'm afraid, because we're going to do things in a leisurely manner today. Because Bob Shaw is a writer who deserves some time and attention, and he's sort of criminally neglected. And I've got the shades on because it's quite sunny out there, so we've returned to the shades, and it's been a busy week. It's been sort of half term. I've been hard at it in the bookshop, and even though I'm a part-time guy these days, it is a lot tougher on us old fellas, you know. So we'll talk about Bob. Bob was born in the 30s. I think it's 31, but I'll stick it up on the screen, maybe a bit later than that. And he was in Belfast, Northern Ireland, and I met him once at the Worldcon in '87 in Brighton, and he signed this to me. He's a lovely, lovely guy. Only met him once, but he was absolutely charming, and everybody said the same. Nobody had a bad word to say about him. And the thing is, if you don't know his name, that's probably because his publishing history since he died, and he died relatively young. He was only in his 60s, it was quite some time ago. It was sort of, I think, about 95. Again, I'll stick the date up. And basically, you know, his work sort of lapsed out of print. His later work probably wasn't as good as his finest period, which I would say was the mid-70s. And I kind of lost interest by then myself. But then I'd lost interest in SF generally by the mid-90s. And he passed on, and his work had sort of leached out of print, and the new big space opera thing was going on. Even though Bob was a hard SF writer, he didn't write big books. He wrote a couple of trilogies, and we'll talk about them, because they are central if you like hard SF. And really, the story I heard was that his partner, or his beneficiary, and this is allegedly the case, wanted more money than publishers like Gollancz were willing to give to get them back into print. They wanted more money for them, and so they languished. I think there might be a couple of ebooks. Gollancz may have done a omnibus at one point 10-15 years ago, but you know, some of them should be masterworks, and they were nearly all published by Gollancz in the UK. So it's a great shame. So really now you're picking up his book second hand, and he's much neglected now, and he's absolutely brilliant. If you like hard SF, if you like good well-written literary SF, he really sort of bridges the gap. So he's the man. So let's have another coffee. So, when does the Shaw canon begin? It begins in the 1960s, and his first 4 books were published in the USA first. Now, for a British writer, that was unusual, and I can't think of many that went that way. Though, of course, you know, you go back to, say, John Wyndham in the 30s when he called himself John Bainan or John Bainan Harris. Then, you know, he was selling to the States, and people were selling to the States and copying the American model. And I wouldn't say that Shaw copied the American model, but he did have more of a proper serious technical bent than most of the British SF writers of his generation, the generation before and after. He was a scientist, and Bob Shaw's great strength is that he was a great writer. Now, what do I mean by a great writer? I mean, this sort of come up a bit in the discussion that Graham and I had recently on Two Grumpy Old Men Discuss SF, that old favourite, and we talked about long books and short books, and we both came out the side of short books generally. That's the way we're wired. And really, I think I thought about this a lot, and in a comment when I was sort of chatting back and forth with somebody in the comments below the video, I basically said that good writing was eloquent, and that eloquence was really the measure of good writing. So what is eloquent? What do I mean by eloquent? Well, I see eloquent writing as that which is incisive, goes to the point, which is stylish, it's done with a flourish and the words are beautiful, it's clear, so it isn't confusing, and it's insightful, so it shows you something new. So eloquence is there. But if you take Oscar Wilde was a genius at eloquent axioms, only an idiot is brilliant before breakfast or whatever it was, those sort of things. And sometimes they don't stand up to close examination, but they sounded brilliant. And eloquence is part of it. Sounding brilliant is as much as the thing as being brilliant, and that's good writing for you. So really what I liked about Shaw was he was crisp in his prose style. He was a consummate artist, and he was really good with getting the science across, even to those of us who are less sort of techie, but doing it in a way which was really, really explanatory and easy. It was definitely part of the story, and he made it very exciting. It wasn't reams and reams and reams of dull stuff. So when I say eloquent, I don't consider a writer like Peter F. Hamilton eloquent. I consider it padded. Whereas Shaw is a classic example of somebody who had ideas popping in all directions, and Ian Watson's like this, and Ian's style is more spiky, but Shaw's is more direct. It's more like Orwell or Priest or Ballard, and it's got that sort of lovely literary quality, but at the same time, the ideas are there and he conveys them, and they're really brilliantly done, and that's what drew me in. If a lot more hard SF writers were like Bob Shaw, I would be well into hard SF in a bigger way than I've ever been. But anyway, so his career starts in the 60s with the first 4 books, and his very first book is the very wonderful Night Walk. And this is a Gollancz hardcover first. It's not a first edition really, it's a UK hardcover first, and I think the world hardcover first as well, probably. And this was issued in about 74, and Night Walk was a paperback original in the USA, and I don't have the US ones, so I'm going to show you the UK ones. And I was a big Shaw nut in the late 70s when I was in my early to mid-teens, and I read a load of them and I absolutely loved them, and this one I remember really well. And it's a super story. I'm just going to reach over here to the secondary podium where you see there's a load of lovely pan lozenges and other things. And this is the Corgi edition of Night Walk. And actually is the chap with the goggles on the cover. And this has got a brilliant conceit to it, which I loved. And this chap, the central character, he becomes a prisoner on another planet. I'm going to take these off because even though it's shiny and any of the eye bags are killing me, it's there. It's about a guy who refuses to cooperate with a secret police force, and he ends up in prison on another planet, and it's going to be a difficult thing to get out. And basically what he does, he's sort of blinded in some way. I can't remember the details. I need to reread it. It's been a long time and it's a cracking, entertaining read. But he devises this device whereby he can see out of the eyes of other people and animals, and hence the sort of the birds there. And there's a wonderful sequence where he's escaping, and he's looking through the eyes of a little Scotty dog. I think it's a Scotty dog, it's a terrier, which is running along the courtyard of the prison as he makes his breakout, and it's running in a different direction to him, so he can see himself in the dog's eyes. That's what it does. And it's wonderful, and it's typical of the sort of brilliant hard SF idea that Shaw would just pop up with and would make a lot of. So there you go, optics. How many people write about optics in SF? And if you read up on visual perception, optics, what we see is in reality is totally different, because we only see certain wavelengths of stuff. I read a book about it a while ago, and it was mind-blowing. What we see is pretty much predicated on our evolution, where we only see what we need to see to survive. So it's a pretty interesting thing. And there's the whole debate about why did Homer in the Odyssey write or say, because it was all tradition, the wine dark sea. Well, the sea isn't the colour of wine. The theory is that our brains are wired differently and our eyes are wired differently then. And there's a book about it called The Origin of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind by Julian Jaynes. Look it up. Amazing book. So it goes into that. So yeah, optics. If hard SF is so big on ideas, why does it keep going on the same thing as the same things? That's the thing. But Shaw, he sort of really pushed the envelope and broke it open. Great stuff, So time for a coffee. So if you want a good fun read and you've never read Shaw before, Night Walk is one to watch out for. But I would say pick them all up as you see them, because they are becoming more uncommon, and they're all worth the read. Some are better than others, and as I say, I'm going to guide you through what I think are the best ones here. So that was the first one. His next book then was the John Wyndham-esque The Two Timers. And there it is, a nice old pan edition. And of course, in the UK, Two Timers is a sort of bit of idiomatic English that we don't really use so much anymore. And it used to be when you were cheating, as our friends the Americans say, that you were two-timing somebody. And he still pops up now and again. Generally, older people like me will use it. And it's about a love, not a love triangle, because there are three people involved, but they're in two different universes. So there are two versions of each person, and it's really nice and fleet and sharp, as you see. And it's a great story, and it's got that romance element. Really well written, and he does get you thinking about the confusions of that. And there's a fairly recent SF film called Coherence, which is similar in basic essence, but this focuses around these two couples and what have you, and it works really well. And again, I've not read it for years. It's very entertaining, so I would recommend that. So as I say, these are American paperback originals first of all. Then things got a bit more cosmic in The Palace of Eternity, which Matt at Bookpilled read a while ago, and he raved about it. It was his first show and he absolutely loved it. And I've read it twice, and it does have big sort of stuff in it, and it says on the back, tremendous story of its interstellar war, and that's part of it. But there's also a thing about consciousness expansion, which is really interesting, and I know that Matt really got off on that, so I'm not going to talk about it too much. So do have a look at what Matt said on Bookpilled. I know he loved it, and I did say to him, Matt, this is just the beginning. There are much better shows than that. So yeah, this is one of his sort of wildest early ones where he really crams a lot in, and that's more towards the cosmic end of stuff. So it's kind of Stapleton meets Joe Haldeman, maybe. Then we come to a book which I haven't read, and with Shaw, even though I've read a lot and I was really keen in my late teens, I got to a period with him when it was a bit off and on and the quality wasn't always there. And like I say, at the end of the 80s, I kind of lost interest, and I'd sort of decided I was only focusing on the best stuff. But I haven't read this one, and this is a book about immortality, and this is 1,000,000 Tomorrows. And I only picked it up quite recently. I haven't read it yet. I've had to flick through it. So that's what I'm saving, because of course when you've got these writers who've passed on, and you hopefully have many years left yourself, you want something to fall back on. I've got one Dostoevsky I haven't read. I read all the others years ago. I've never read The Idiot. I've got that held back when I'm really in the mood, because that's the last one. It's the only one I haven't read. So I've been holding that back, so I'll read that at some point. So that's that one. So as you see, he covered another classic theme there. By this time we're in the 70s, and Bob's sort of next book was one which I've reread quite recently, and that's Ground Zero Man. And what a great title, Ground Zero Man. They used to fire the imagination. This is a near-future SF novel in which the central character, who works, I think, for some sort of engineering firm, or maybe it's weapons or aeronautics, I can't recall, he devises this device which can cause a chain reaction and set off all the nukes on the planet at once. And he uses this to try and blackmail the authorities in every country with weapons of mass destruction to give them up. Otherwise, he's going to send the planet totally nova with them. And he hides out in a house in England, and it's all about his relationship with his wife. And Shaw is really brilliant on human relationships. He's very good at spiky relationships between men and women. He's very good at subtly delineating the classic differences between men and women, and the sort of driven aspects of men, the more domestic aspects of some women. And you could say he was a product of his time, and yeah, there is that, but there are some sort of certain verities and truths about the way he writes about men and women which are really sort of reflect a lot of experiences that both sexes have had with each other. And I think that's one of his reasons for his popularity as well. I've talked to female SF fans who thought he was really good too. And yeah, so this is really well drawn. It's thrilling. It's near future, as I say, so you could read it almost like a techno thriller. And Ground Zero Man, and it was revised and expanded in the mid-80s and retitled, and I really didn't like the title, and this was the new title, and that's The Peace Machine, which I always thought was a really rubbish title compared to Ground Zero Man. I mean, Ground Zero Man is so dramatic, and I am a sucker for good titles, and but Ground Zero Man, The Peace Machine, was it like, oh, I don't understand what Ground Zero means, because of course, before 9/11, when it got bandied about a lot then, it meant the area immediately below where a bomb of the atomic or nuclear variety would be set off in the atmosphere above and sort of hit the ground. It's above the ground, so that was ground zero, so the mushroom cloud and what have you. So it was redone as the Peace Machine, and I have to say that title never did it for me. And in the mid 80s, Shaw, he sort of revised a few of his books, or retitled them. They were tinkered with a bit, and a lot of writers do this, and it doesn't always work. And I really didn't think a lot of that title, and it happened with another one. We'll come to that later on, but that's a good one. And he always did a lot of short stories, and his most famous short story, which is called The Light of Other Days, I think was published in about 67, and I think it might have been published in analog, and it was certainly published in a magazine separately before it became part of a book. And I think Shaw planned it and thought about it for something like 4 years before he wrote it. And John W. Campbell Jr. loved it so much that he himself wrote a sequel to it called Burden of Proof, which I've never read. I must try and track that down. Because Campbell, of course, was mostly known as an editor. He did most of his writing under the name Don A. Stewart in the 1930s. So I need to look into that, and I'd forgotten about that. It just popped into my head now, funny enough. So Shaw did lots of short stories. This is a collection, Tomorrow Lies in Ambush. I don't think I've ever actually read this. And where I'm lacking in my Shaw reading is that I've not read many of the shorts. Oh gosh, there's one in here called The Weapons of Isha 2. So there's a Van Vogt thing. There's a Van Vogt influence over Shaw's I'll talk about later. So worth looking for. This is a very, very uncommon book in hardcover. I've got lots of Shaw's in hardcover. This one for some reason is very uncommon, so watch out for it and try and snap it up. It's not a common book anyway, and this is a very old pan one, as you can see. So at some point I must get that under my belt. Then around at the same time as that, we came to Shaw's absolute masterpiece, which I've mentioned on the channel before. It's one of my favourite books. I mentioned it in a video very recently in the Books That Made Me, and I'm going to present to you very proudly a first edition of it, and that is the very wonderful Other Days, Other Eyes, which I think is magnificent. When I first read this, I was 15 or 16. The Light of Other Days is a short story that's in it, and basically there's several short stories and there's a bigger frame narrative around it. The frame narrative is the bigger part of the book, and I put in 100 must-read science fiction novels, my book, and it's absolutely magnificent. I can't say enough good about it. And let's see, we've got a panel lozenge of it somewhere here with a cracking jacket design, and it was that made me pick it up. And you'll see it, you see at the top, there's a window, a sash window. The upper sash is lifted, and the window is open at the bottom, and you see the lady is sort of cut in half. Now when you look through a window, does that happen? No, it doesn't. And that's at the heart of what this is. And this is where, as a hard SF writer, Shaw really sort of kicked everybody else out of the ballpark. It's an optics idea, and it's a physics idea as well. Basically, it's about a guy, and his name, what's his name? Is it Randall? He's really well drawn. Alban Garrod. What a great name, Alban. Alban, of course, makes me think of Albion. Britain, it makes me think of Alba, Scotland. Alban Garrod, scientist and amateur detective. He basically, by accident, he creates a new type of glass, and what he does is he grinds this particular type of glass for an experimental aircraft, and when they're test flying this aircraft, it crashes, and and he's trying to work out why. Then he realizes the properties of this particular glass slow down light, and they slowed it down infinitesimally, but enough for it to interfere with what the pilot is seeing. So there is timings all off, and he thinks, wow, and he keeps it to himself, and he goes underground and he patents it, and he experiments with slow glass, and in some cases the grain of the glass can slow light down by decades. So you get this wonderful situation in The Light of Other Days, one of the stories which makes up the novel, that there's a business where people have slabs of slow glass which take 20 years for light to pass through. And fundamentally what happens then, the light is pouring through them, and people position these slabs of glass over beautiful views like the one I can see out my window, and they leave them there for 20 years, so you'll get a view of mountains and a forest and a valley or what have you, beautiful stuff. And then people buy them and hang them on their wall like a painting, except it's a window, so it looks just like you're looking out a window. So if you have a bit of this very slow glass, it looks as if you're just gazing out of a window and you've got this beautiful view when you probably live in a tower block or something. And there's lots of other applications, and it gets used in all sorts of ways. I'm not going to tell you which ways, and it has a massive impact on Alban and his wife, and the way that their relationship is depicted is very mature. And you know, Shaw, just he has all the virtues of a proper mainstream literary novelist, and that's the thing that I loved about him. He was up there, he could write with the best. You know, he could have been a mainstream novelist, and in some of his novels the mainstream sort of near-future parts are even better than the science. But the two in his best novels, the two things are balanced. And Other Days, Other Eyes is very poignant, it's very moving. There's a lot in there about memory, perception, time, and so it ties in very well with new wave conceits like entropy and identity and all those sort of things. But at the same time, it's got this wonderful hard science thing at its core, and it really shows how tech affects human beings. And even though slow glass is very different to the sort of tech that we actually have in the world today, I see it as analogous to things like the internet and the mobile phone. It's that sort of thing. It's something which really changes the world. And I can't really say enough good about this book. And if you only ever read one Bob Shaw book, Other Days, Other Eyes is magnificent. It really should be a Goliath's masterwork. If it was up to me, it'd be a Penguin Modern Classic. For me, the writing is there, the concepts are there, and it's just stunning original, and there aren't any sequels, which is fantastic. You don't get more of the same. He makes the point, he says it. Wonderful novum, slow glass, paradigm shift, changes the world, conceptual breakthrough, changes the world again at the end. Magnificent, pure SF. It ticks all the boxes and then some. Get out there, buy it, even if you never go anywhere near anything else. I really cannot say enough good about this book, one of my favourite books of all time. So that was a great one. And he was kind of on a roll then. And then came his big book, the book which most people love. I have to say I'm less fond of it, but I can see why people like it. And if you're the hard SF nut who likes the big dumb object and the cosmic stuff, then Orbitsville is the book for you. And there are 2 sequels, which I'll admit I've never read because it's not my sort of thing. Typical Shaw character, sort of bellicose middle-aged man. He's about 39, 40, approaching middle age, called Vance Garriman, set in the future. Earth is ruled by a tyrannical president called Elizabeth, and she's interesting. She has that thing where anybody can have plastic surgery and look beautiful, and she chooses not to. That reminds me, I get the feeling that that's a thing in SF. It comes up in other things, and you get it most famously in Neuromancer at the beginning, where there's the observation when Case goes in the bar right at the very beginning in Cheaper City. You know, he says that rats, you know, in the age of affordable beauty, rats his prosthetic arm. You know, it was something heraldic about his disinterest in making himself beautiful. What fantastic stuff! And you get that, and something happens to Vance Garamond, and he earns the wrath, unfairly, of this Earth president, and he makes off in a spaceship because his spaceship's sort of commander, and Earth has only got one other colony planet, and it's a bit of a racket. There's kind of a racket going on where people can go and live on this colony planet, but they've got to pay the passage. They can go to the planet for free, but they've got to pay the passage. And it's a bit sort of, you know, it is a kind of tyrannical thing. It's not fully dystopian, but it's not very pleasant. And he makes off, and the way that the spaceships are described, they're sort of powering and everything. He talks about them having, it's the old thing about having a scoop to sort of pick up particles, the interstellar, so the solar winds, there's all these particles out in space. It's not a pure vacuum. And the idea of you siphon them in, and then you have them in a reaction chamber to fire the starship. And that's done with magnetic fields rather than sort of big metal scoops. It is beautifully described and explained. And the whole thing about the weather, they talk about the sort of the weather in space. It's about whether there are waves of particles and whether you'll catch the wave. So it's got that beautiful poetic sort of sailing ship thing at the beginning. And then Shaw goes into how you can go faster than light, and how Einsteinian physics has been superseded by Arthurian physics. And it's got tons of that stuff in it, but it's very, very well written. And they zip off and they find this huge artifact, which is a Dyson sphere, which has a small opening about 1 kilometre wide in it. And you can go inside and there's this massive space inside it. And, you know, if you like a big dumb object, it's a big clever object. It's not really my kind of thing. But it's less than 200 pages long. It's very sharp, Vance Gamble is very driven. He's quite selfish at times, and you know, you see that sort of thing where Shaw is really good at these spiky characters. And in that, if you like Brian Stableford's 70s space operas, it's a similar ballpark. And there's a kind of poetry about this in the science, which Shaw's really good at, and he makes it all sound completely convincing without it being reams and reams and reams of dull stuff. And it just reads beautifully. So if you're the sort of person who doesn't usually get on with hard SF and wants well-written stuff, you will like this. And I have to say that, you know, if you love that really tough stuff, if you like things like Ringworld and you like Arthur C. Clarke and all the other BDA books, even if you like people like Banksy and Reynolds and stuff, then, you know, you love this, even though it's a lot shorter. So get used to more eloquent writing, the eloquent, concise, crisp, to the point, incisive writing that Shaw does. So even though it's not my sort of jam, if you want to read a BDA book, a BDO book, BDA, Big Dumb Object book, this is great. And it's Big Dumb Object without it being too dumb. There are 2 sequels. Now, the fact is, the critical consensus seems to suggest that, you know, the third one didn't come until the 90s, and the second one was in the 80s. This won the BSFA award in 75, and so it just gives you an idea of what people liked at that time in British fan circles. The following year was Brontemeg by Michael Coney, which is a great book, and that's kind of a planetary romance kind of thing more, but that's got hard SF elements, and it's not unserious. It's very well written as well. So you get the idea of what people were reading then in British fandom. I see the influence of this everywhere. I mean, when I first read Schismatrix by Bruce Sterling, I can see an influence in that, and you know, it's great stuff if you like that sort of thing. I'd say it's not for me, but if you're on the literary end and you fancy dipping your toe into a hard SF novel, I would go with that. But I'd say with Shaw, he was really good at getting the science across in all sorts of ways. Very different book to Other Days, Other Eyes, or for example, The Two Timers, but the science is there in all of them. You know, he doesn't sort of like just say, oh, this is going to be a time travel story. He goes into the science, and he's very, very good. He used to do a thing at conventions where he'd do Bob Shaw's serious science talk, and he would start serious and it would become a load of old jokes and stuff then by the end. But it was one of those things you weren't supposed to giggle, but everybody knew they would. So there you go. Then that was his big hit. Then I think came, for me, his other keynote book after Other Days, Other Eyes. And again, this was one I read in my teens, had a huge impact, and I've read it, like Other Days, Other Eyes, I've read it several times. I must have read them sort of 4 to 6 times each. So I'm just going to take this off pride place in the podium. And then the very, very magnificent A Wreath of Stars. There it is. And this is a first of Shaw Uncommon in good nick. I've got quite a few, as you can see. I'm trying to build my collection up, and you know, they've rocketed up in value. They're quite hard to find, and he was prolific, you know, a lot of books, and this is truly great stuff. And here's a pan lozenge here, which I'm going to show you now, which you'll have seen on the channel before. There we go. Notice that little guy in that underground thing. What is it all about? So Rita Stars is set again on a really good hard science idea. There's an anti-neutrino planet, so it's an antimatter planet called Thornton's planet, and it's detected and it's coming towards Earth. So it's a different sort of universe, the same universe but antimatter, and it can only be seen through a certain type of lenses, certain type of glasses which have been developed recently. You see again optics is a physical thing, it's part of physics. You see Shaw brings optics in again, yet again, a sort of 3rd or 4th time. It's brilliant. And you know, if you put the lenses on, and for some reason it takes place in an African state. It's a fictional African state called Burundi, which obviously sounds like Burundi. And the miners are wearing these magnetic lenses, and they're wearing them down in the mines, I think, to help them see better. And they see these ghosts, and it's the anti-neutrino planet passing through the Earth, and it's the denizens of that planet. So it's got, and it goes on from there. And I mean, that sounds fantastic, but you really can't put it down, and it's got wonderful sort of characters and human relationships and what have you in it, and the implications of the passing of the neutrino planet through the Earth. And again, it's a wonderful example, like Other Days, Other Eyes, of a hard SF story that has wonderful original science ideas in it. Really, truly fantastic novum, and really well drawn, beautiful characters. And there's something very moving and elegiac, or elegiac as I pronounce it. You know, there's something very T.S. Eliot about this, and it really does leave a a sort of disconsolate feel in your mouth, and it's sort of sad and poignant, and I can't really say enough good about it. It's a very moving book and a very, very clever book, and I think Rita Stars and Other Days, Other Eyes, I mean, the two together for me are central, and to me these are absolute masterpieces and never improved on in his canon. He did lots of other good books, but these are really quite something, so watch out for that. I mean, if you like Robert Silverberg, and you like people like Christopher Priest, if you like Tom Dish, even though Shaw doesn't have that sort of mordant humour, you'd like these things. They're great books. Equally, you like them if you like Heinlein and Niven. That's the beauty of them. They really do tread that sort of middle ground between good literary writing and solid genre SF. So he's kind of a unique guy that way. He's one of the few who can do that. And other people came in his wake, you know, and Robert Charles Wilson, I think, is somebody who works like that quite well as well at times. So there you go. He kept working away at short stories and produced Cosmic Kaleidoscope. There's another one for you. Lots of good stuff in there, and there's a pan lozenge just there, very beautiful, not to be sniffed at. And maybe we'll have a look at that again. It's on the pan lozenge video, so you can have a look at it on there. And then he produced a book which I've read a couple of times, which the first time I wasn't so keen, and the second time it really grew on me, and somebody mentioned on the channel recently they felt it was quite minor. And this is Medusas Children, and Medusas Children reminded me a lot when I read it and reread it of some of the works of Michael Coney. It reminded me particularly of, there's a Michael Coney book called Neptune's Cauldron, which is set underwater. This is mostly set underwater, it's obvious, but it reminded me more of a book called The Ultimate Jungle, which is one of my favourite Coneys, and it's very sort of superheated sort of thing. And The Ultimate Jungle is rather like a cross between Aldis's Hot House and Non-Stop put together, so it's very, very interesting. But Medusas Children is an underwater story. It's quite sharp and fleet, and I enjoyed it a lot more on the second reading, and I can remember sort of the feel of certain sequences of it underwater which were beautifully done. And with Shaw you always get this wonderful thing about relationships between men and women. There's some quite sexy bits which are very well done, and I'll just give you a description. That's the pan lozenge, which I think is absolutely lovely. I love the colours of that. And it says, the clan live in a strange undersea world amid a cluster of nets and metal objects anchored to the root system of a giant plant. This is the home, and outside it lie the hazards of the deep, especially the voracious and many-tentacled horror. So, you know, it's an interesting thing. It's an underwater thing. There's a special underwater world. It's got its own mythology, but it's the characters are really well drawn, and I really like it. I like Medusas Children. It's one I can pick up as a good fun read, and it has all the virtues of his other books. It's maybe not as strong as the best ones, but it is one of my favourite minor Shaws. And underwater stories are usually really, really boring and terrible, but you can feel the salt in this one. And there's a moment I seem to recall where one of the female characters is clambering out of the water into an airlock or something like that, and the point of view character is thinking about, you know, the way her body looks and the water dripping off her and stuff, and she's topless. You know, it's quite sexy, as I say, but it's really sort of well drawn, and you can feel the sort of tincture of the salt and the water, and you can taste it, and that's what you want in a book about the sea. You need to have that sort of thing where you can taste and smell it and see it. You know, you need the sensory input, and it's very much there in Medusas Children. So I like it. I'm rating it more highly than I used to, and I think it's got a lot of virtues, so that's one of my favourites. Right, then we come on to another absolute favourite, and now we're sort of late 70s. This is 77. This is one I read within a couple of years of it coming out, I think, and again I picked it up because it was a pan lozenge, and I'm just going to show you the pan lozenge. And that's a very, very funny book called Who Goes Here. There it is, Who Goes Here. And if you like Robert Sheckley, Who Goes Here is the thing. It's Bob's first real attempt to write a funny book. This is the hardcover first edition. There it is, and it's about a chap called War and Peace. You know, obviously a pun on War and Peace, and War and Peace was a name that one of David Bowie's backing singers, Jeffrey McCormack, used. He was on Diamond Dogs. He co-wrote Rock and Roll With Me, which is my least favourite song on Diamond Dogs, which is otherwise a great science fiction record. So War and Peace, and this guy is, it's the future, and it's got an absurdist tone throughout. It's not ha 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 ha, but you know, it is things like Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, Dimension of Miracles by Sheckley. It's well worth the read. It's satirical. It's not as sharp and astringent as, say, Sheckley is. It's not like downing a bit of vodka. It's more like, you know, a finely poured bourbon with a little bit of cola in there. You know, you sip it gently, you've got lots of ice in it. It's that sort of thing. And War and Peace, he wakes up at a sort of military draft thing. Basically, he's decided to join the military, and when you join the military, your brain is wiped of your previous memory. So obviously he wants to forget something, he wants to try and find out what he's forgotten, and that's what drives it. So it's got a little bit of a quest-based narrative, and he's a bit of a Sancho Panza type character as well, and he has all sorts of escapades. He's in the army, he doesn't want to be in it, even though his previous self, which had itself wiped, you obviously want him to be, and you follow him on this little journey, and there's all sorts of incident, and it's very witty. So it's kind of better organised than Sheckley. Sheckley's sort of very episodic, and he clearly would get bored really quickly and move on from one thing to another, make a satirical point somewhere else. So the plotting wasn't always there. Shaw's a bit more rational than Sheckley, and it does show. So the balance is really there. So it's a good, witty, fun book. It's not nerdy like a Terry Pratchett book or a Douglas Adams book. It doesn't have that nerdy ooh sort of thing in it. It is sort of more sort of broader humour. It is a light book, and it's a fun book, and I absolutely love it. And when I was a teenager, I would read Other Days and Other Eyes and Rita Stars for the serious stuff, and then I would sort of chill out with it. You know, it's great stuff, and it's a book which I go back to time and time again. Probably my favourite comic SF novel. I probably like it more than some of the Sheckleys. Sheckley, the short stories, I think, are the thing, but really, really good. He wrote a sequel years later, which came out about 93, called War and Peace, which isn't as good, and it was too long after. It just didn't come together in the same way, and I think people tend not to mention it very much. It gets brushed under the carpet, and it's a shame. I don't have that one actually. I should try and pick it up just for the sake of completism, but Hugo Sure, marvellous stuff. So as you see, there's a lot of variety, and as we draw then towards the end of the 70s, something he did next. What did he do next? He did his Van Vogt tribute, Ship of Strangers, which, you know, if you look this up on the internet, some people say it's a collection of stories. Well, it is. It's kind of a fix-up. It is really good, and it's about a starship voyage of discovery, and it's dedicated in there to A. Van Vogt. So, of course, instantly you're referencing the Voyage of the Space Beagle, Black Destroyer, Discord in Scarlet. You know, those seminal stories which inspired Forbidden Planet, Star Trek, Alien. They all come from that. It's the mother lode, and there is a video about the influence of Van Vogt's Space Beagle on the channel, so do look at that because it's very important. So Ship of Strangers, nice pan lozenge as you see, and I haven't read this for years, so I must sort of do it. And basically it is a thing about a shape-shifting alien in here, and yeah, again, there's similarities with what Stableford was doing at that time with the Daedalus missions. You know, they're great books, and again, it's got some poetic moments, and some people saw it as a bit of a sort of step backward at that point after all these other things, but you know, he was doing a homage, and I really like it. I think it's good. I need to revisit it because I've only read it once and it was great, so I'm going to go back to that one at some point before too long and see what I get out of it. Then came a more minor book, which again was revised a bit later, and that's Vertigo, which later on, as I say, it was revised and retitled as Terminal Velocity. You know, this is sort of the mid-80s. This is about 78, Terminal Velocity. It all sounds very cool and Hollywood, doesn't it? I prefer Vertigo, and it's got a nice little panel-lozenge cover there with the guy plunging downward. And, you know, it's about jetpacks, anti-gravity harnesses rather than jetpacks. And, you know, it's the new craze. It's rather like the sort of electric scooters we're seeing now. You know, it's all about the implications. It's about a policeman as the central character, and people sort of form gangs and start doing Clockwork Orangey type things, and it's pacey and fast moving, but it's quite a minor one. But again, you know, it looks at real tech and how it impacts, you know, so it is kind of analogous to some of the things which have happened with the sort of scooters and these crazes which come and go and concern about youth things. And, you know, there haven't been any which I think some people have been thieving from them, but in terms of things, no. So there you go. So that is kind of a minor one. As I say, reissued as Terminal Velocity. Why? Who knows? I've not read Terminal Velocity, so it might be different textually to that. I'm not certain, to be honest. Another one I haven't read, I'm just going to show it to you because I only picked it up a little while ago, probably about a year and a half, not got around to yet, is the series Solution. And on the front it says, after Ballard himself, Bob Shaw is the nearest we've got to a homegrown great, says Martin Amis. Look at that. High praise indeed from Martin in the Observer. And of course Martin read loads of SF when he was a kid because his dad Kingsley liked it. So yeah, and that's high praise. I mean, would I say Shaw is, the best after Ballard? Well, I wouldn't go quite that far. I would say that at this point Chris Priest was, but really Shaw is very, very good and underrated, and you need to sort of pick his stuff up if you haven't got it, so do look at that. And I say that's another one I'm holding back, so I'm looking forward to that. That's just sitting on the shelf nicely for me to pick up when I'm in a Bob mode, which is great, which I am every now and again, so we'll get there. Then came a short story collection called A Better Man Trap, which Shock Horror Probe I don't have, but I just bought one online from somebody on eBay and I'm waiting for that to come, so I'll show you that in a future book haul. Better Man Trap, obviously sort of riffing on the cliche of a better mousetrap, of taking something and improving it inventively, and that's what Shaw was very good at. He took some traditional themes and he could put a spin on them, so presumably those short stories show him doing that, so we look forward to that. And as I say, I need to read more short stories, and I'm sure there's lots of really hardcore fans out there saying, Steve, why haven't you read them? Shocking. Then we had Orbitsville Departure, which was the second Orbitsville book. Then came, this is one I remember reading, I remember it really vividly when I've read it when it first came out, and I had a paperback of it, and this would have been in, I think, 85, and I'd only been in Bath for a short period of time, and this is Firepan from 1984. And as you see, Gollanc's yellow jacket with a stunning design, lots of green, red and some flames at the bottom there, Fire Pattern. Do like that title. And this starts off really, really well. It's got one of my favourite sort of openings of any Shaw book, and it's about the mystery of spontaneous human combustion. And I've just realised that I missed out Dagger of the Mind, which came out a little bit earlier. Now, I talked about Dagger in a previous video, so I really should sort of talk about that. Now, Dagger for me, like Fire Pattern, was unfortunately one of the weaker ones. There it is. And the thing about this is that this is a sort of contemporaneous book set in the late sort of 70s, and the parts which are pure mainstream, they depict ordinary people, and the characterization is absolutely brilliant. But then as it goes further into it, it gets more and more mysterious. It is an interesting book, and you would then have these typical SF trope comes up, and they just, it just doesn't work. They're just horrible and silly, and it's one of his weakest books. Fire Pattern is rather like Dagger of the Mind, and it's got a brilliant start, interesting thing, and you think, well, what is he going to do with spontaneous human combustion? This is going to be really interesting. You expect the sort of things he does with Optics in Other Days, Other Eyes and A Rita Stars, and you're thinking that he's going to pull something really interesting out of it, but unfortunately he pulls something out which again is too prosaic, and his prosaic is not prosaic, in the real world it would be quite astonishing, but it's prosaic in SF terms. He pulls out an old SF cliche. This is pretty much the same one he does in Dagger of the Mind, and it really got silly, and I really didn't like it. It's a shame because 2/3 of the way through it's really, really good. I want to reread it because it's been a long time and maybe I was too harsh to it, so I need to look back at it. So I've acquired it fairly recently to give it another go. But Dagger of the Mind, Fire Pattern, they show that he's sort of returning to pulp sort of forms for his ideas, and maybe he's running out of ideas there. And commercially I'm not sure what his career was like. He always had quite a few books in print. The Panel Lozenge was sort of coming to an end in the early 80s, and he sort of was with Gollancz, say, all the way through with the hardcovers, and you did get a feeling it was maybe a bit up and down, and he never had the bestseller he should have. Orbitsville was the closest one, but this is an interesting book, but a flawed one. But I'm going to revisit it, and when I do, I'll do a re-review on the channel for you, so we shall see. Then came a moment really in which he is deemed critically to have a renaissance, and that comes with The Ragged Astronauts from 1986. And this is the first, as I say, and I got Bob to sign this for me when I met him at the World Con, as I said at the beginning, and there you go, lovely. Lovely man, and he was absolutely charming. I can't say, he was one of the nicest authors I've ever met. I only talked to him for a few minutes, but a really lovely guy. This is about a planet. It's like a binary system, two planets together, and they've had like a shared atmosphere. There's like a pillar of atmosphere between them, so they're quite close. And it's about the people who live there, and they've got a sort of Renaissance sort of era level civilization, and they basically use balloons to travel from one planet to the other. It's sort of a voyage of discovery. It's very Vernian, and it feels like sort of very old school scientific romance, or even a proto SF novel from the 17th, 18th century. You know, it's the whole Montgolfier brothers thing, the golden age of ballooning, as they said in Monty Python. And it's got enormous charm, you know, and it's great, and the science is really good, and you get the wonderful moment when they're flying from one planet to another across this sort of cone of air, how the balloon is going to turn upside down to orient itself to go down to the other planet and stuff. And it all seems quite absurd, but it's really elegantly done. And it's great fun as well, you know. There are two sequels. I read those as well. They didn't do as much for me. And again, it's that thing of, I think, maybe stretching an idea too far. I was happy with this as a singleton, but it's not resolved. And it's the same with Orbitsville. At the end of Orbitsville, there is a lot more story. And it's an interesting thing when you get these sort of hard science trilogies. If you look at things like Rama and 2001, there's classic Clark things where there's these enigmatic artifacts and you don't quite know what's going on. There's a bit of that in Gateway as well by Frederick Pohl, you know, and I like it when the mystery is still there and it's not resolved. You know, it's that thing of, oh, you know, the cosmic. But of course, commercially, a lot of people want to know what the answer is, and you know, and obviously aesthetically as well, they want to know what the writer's doing. Otherwise it seems like a cop-out. They want a resolution, and that's fair enough. They want the conceptual breakthrough and they want it to move to the other level, but sometimes the impact is diminished with that sort of thing unless the author's got the imagination, and very often it's the mystery itself is enough. And I certainly find that with Clark's work, and there's all those sequels which to me sometimes undermine the beauty of what's in the actual original novels and the sequences, and then they're done for commercial reasons later on. I know I harp on about this, but it is important. Sometimes mystery is enough. And you know, you can understand the frustration. I mean, Chris Priest, when he reviewed Drama, he said, well, you know, it appears nobody knows anything. Nobody knows anything in the end. And then it goes. He said, it's not really very satisfying. And Chris is somebody who likes, you know, those very strange endings and things, as you know if you've read his work. But I can see that, but at the same time it was too much for me. But then again, like I say, I'm not really a hard SF guy. So there were other things after that, which, you know, I didn't sort of go into. There's a juvenile called Killer Planet, which I've never read. There's a late short story collection called Dark Night in Thailand, which I have read, but I don't have. I didn't feel he was cooking on all cylinders then. There was Orbitsville Judgment, completed it. And then Shaw died in the mid-90s. But he had a fantastic career, and heck of a nice guy, as I say. I can't get over my memory of him. He was such a lovely, lovely chap. He really made a big impression. And he wrote some fantastic books. You know, even the things which people consider minor, like Medusas Children, I think are great reads. And I'm glad I've got some which I haven't read. And there's some I've only read once I can go back to. But I would say Other Days, Other Eyes, Rita Stars, Who Goes Sure, absolute masterpieces, and lots of others to choose from, as you can see. So I hope that gets you thinking about Shaw, getting out there to read them. And I really do think he's the best hard SF writer you've never read, because he's the best writer that I've read of the people who are hard SF writers. And he's unusual in the British tradition, because even though, you know, I guess his spiritual children would be people like Paul Macaulay, Stephen Baxter is more like Clark. Macaulay, I think, say, is probably the writer who has got that sort of writerly sort of thing, which Shaw has as well, but nobody quite has it like Shaw. Shaw could very easily have stepped over the line and written mainstream novels, though, you know, they wouldn't have had the ideas to interest him. He wrote about people and relationships and characters really, really beautifully and really well, with a deftness and sureness and suppleness of tone, which I think is almost unique, you know. So I put him up there. If you like the new wave guys, you like your Ballard, your Priest, your M. John, all those things, Shaw is the perfect bridge between them and hard SF. So this is Outlaw Bookseller. Thanks for your support, for watching the channel. Super thanks if you desire. Subscriptions are going up. We are struggling with views. We do need a lot more views, so please share all my stuff on social media. And next time I'll wear something smarter. The video would have picked up a shirt for me to wear out of the cupboard. So why don't you wear this? I'll wash this shirt if you wear it, and I'm going to save it because it's quite glam, and I'm feeling sort of very sedate and relaxed today. So we'll wear that for something more glamorous. Anyway, bye for now. I guess this will go at the end as the blooper reel.